Today I'd like to correct a mistake made by one of my absolute favorite channels on YouTube, Fortnine. They make top-notch motorcycling content. I watch a lot of their videos, so before we proceed, I'd like to make it very clear that this video is in no way an attempt to somehow diminish their credibility or tarnish their reputation or whatever, because first of all, this is a pretty mind-boggling topic, and secondly, we all make mistakes. Universities, governments, scientists, you, me, everybody. To err is human, but I believe it is important to identify, correct, and learn from our mistakes. So with that in mind, let us continue, see where the problem is, and learn about Crossplane twin-cylinder engines in the process because they are very interesting. So as you can probably already tell, the issue is with Fortnine's recent video on 270-degree offset inline twin or crossplane inline twin engines, where they make the following claims. Number one, they claim that 285-degree inline twin engines are more balanced. Specifically, they have a better secondary balance than 270-degree crossplane twin engines.
Meaning a perfect crossplane twin in terms of secondary imbalance is not a 270, it's a 285.
Number two, they claim that because of this balance, Phil Irving, who can be considered the father of the crossplane twin engine, originally proposed the 285-degree twin and not the 270-degree one.
285 is the answer. That is what Phil Irving envisioned 60 years ago. That's what Dick Cookson built 30 years ago, but it's not what we're being given today.
And finally, number three, they claim that making 285-degree twin engines is more expensive and that KTM is the only company making them because they are
a company that isn't afraid to spend money and charge money in the pursuit of absolute performance.
Unfortunately, all of these claims are wrong. And to understand why, we have to understand engine balance. Now, I've explained engine balance many times in my previous videos, and if you have a firm grasp of it, then you can skip to this point here. If you do not have a firm grasp on engine balance, then I do not suggest skipping, because to understand all of this, you really need to understand primary and secondary engine balance. So, primary engine balance it's created by the piston. Secondary engine balance is created, or imbalance is created by the rod. These are two things that occur simultaneously in the engine, but they must be observed separately, independently, to understand engine balance. First up, let's start with primary imbalances created by the piston. Starting from top dead center, the piston accelerates downward. It then reaches peak velocity at 75 degrees. I will explain why it is 75 in just a few moments. It then decelerates towards bottom dead center. At bottom dead center, it changes direction, accelerates upward, again reaches peak velocity at 285 degrees of rotation, and then again decelerates towards top dead center. Now, during engine operation, the mass of the piston is hopefully constant. And as we know, force is mass times acceleration. So if mass is constant, then the forces generated by the piston, which are the source of primary imbalances, are entirely dependent on piston acceleration. And as we can see, the greatest piston acceleration occurs at top and bottom dead center. This is very intuitive and easy to understand. This is why primary balance is not confusing, because if you take an object, we experience this often in life, and you try to move it rapidly up and down like a piston, you will see that the object exerts the greatest force at the top and bottom of its travel path when you try to force it to change direction. If we plot the forces generated by a piston on a graph, where force magnitude is the y-axis and engine rotation degrees is the x-axis, we get something like this. As you can see, we have peak upward force at top dead center and peak downward force at bottom dead center. This force, the primary force, shakes the engine up and down as it's running. And to restore primary balance, all we need is another piston offset by 180 degrees from the first piston. The forces of the piston can now cancel out each other, and this is the logic we find behind a 180-degree inline twin engine. Next up, we're going to explain secondary balance. This is the confusing one, so pay attention. The culprit, the singular culprit behind the secondary imbalances of an engine is the connecting rod, and the fact that the connecting rod changes its angle. It angles as the engine operates. We have to observe the connecting rod isolated from the rest of the engine to understand secondary imbalance. Because the rod changes its angle, it means that the relative length of the connecting rod in relation to the distance between the piston and the crankshaft changes. The absolute length of the connecting rod hopefully always stays the same. The connecting rod is a fixed metal item, but its relative length changes. If we observe the engine in operation, we can see that at top and bottom dead center, the connecting rod is fully upright. At 90 and 270 degrees of rotation, the connecting rod is fully angled. Of course, a rod fully angled is shorter in relation to the piston and the crankshaft than a rod fully upright. So as the engine rotates from 0 to 90 degrees, the connecting rod transitions from fully upright to fully angled, which means that the rod is becoming shorter in relation to the piston and the crankshaft. As the rod shortens, this relative shortening of the rod, it pulls the piston down by an additional little distance. This little distance has its little acceleration because the rod transitions into its angled position. It accelerates the piston by an additional little amount. And this is why the piston achieves peak velocity at 75 and not at 90 degrees, which is half the actual stroke. One stroke is 180 degrees, so logic tells us that peak velocity should be at 90 and not at 75 degrees. But because the rod adds a little bit of additional acceleration as it angles, relatively shortens, it pulls the piston down a bit, and so the piston reaches peak velocity sooner. But because the rod creates a little acceleration and the piston has a mass, we have these little secondary forces. The rod, of course, doesn't create as much acceleration as the main movement of the engine, what is generated by the stroke of the crankshaft, but it still creates a little acceleration, and some mass gives us a little force. Secondary forces are usually about 1/4 of primary forces, and secondary vibrations are about 1/4 of magnitude of primary vibrations. However, they are twice as frequent because the rod changes its angle, its position 4 times. So we go from fully upright to fully angled, from fully angled to fully upright, from fully upright to fully angled, and again from fully angled to fully upright. And the piston changes direction only twice. So primary imbalances occur twice for every engine rotation, primary vibrations, and secondary imbalances or vibration, they occur 4 times for every engine revolution because that's how many times the rod changes its position. Now, if we were to plot the secondary forces generated by the relative shortening and lengthening of the rod, they would look like this. As you can see, secondary forces point down at 90 and 270, and they point up at top and bottom dead center. This occurs because the rod becomes fully angled at 90 and 270. In other words, it pulls the piston down as it shortens, and it pushes the piston up as it becomes upright or lengthens in relation to the piston and the crankshaft. Now, if we combine these two, the primary and the secondary forces, we get the total force that is exerted onto the engine. As you can see, when we observe primary forces alone, or the piston isolated from the rod, peak velocity is indeed at 90 degrees. But when we observe the engine as a whole, when we add up the primary and secondary forces, then peak velocity occurs at 75 degrees. And that is because the additional acceleration created by the rod, which we just explained. Now let's apply our newfound and not at all confusing knowledge of primary and secondary balance onto 270 and 285 crossplane twins. Let's start with primary balance. In a 270 degree twin, we have 270 or 90 degrees of offset between the two pistons. So as piston 1 is at top dead center, piston 2 is at 90 degrees of rotation. This means that piston 1 is exerting a maximum upward force, whereas piston 2 is at peak velocity and is exerting 0 force. So we have maximum upward force on one side of the engine. In the case of the 285-degree engine, when piston 1 is at top dead center, the other piston will be 75 degrees after top dead center, so just 15 degrees before peak velocity. In other words, the other piston is not at zero force. It is still producing a small upward force. This means that the engine as a whole produces an upward force, which is overall greater in the case of the 285 engine because the other piston is also producing a small upward force, and forces of different magnitude but equal direction stack up. So the 285 engine has a worse primary balance compared to the 270 engine. Next, secondary balance. First, let's talk about the 270 twin. Piston 1 is at top dead center, rod is fully upright, so we have upward secondary force on piston 1. Piston 2 is at 90 degrees, rod fully angled, so we have a downward secondary force. The two forces of equal magnitude and opposite direction cancel out, leading to perfect secondary balance. It's actually not perfect because the forces are offset by a distance between them, so we get a rocking couple, but for simplicity, let's just ignore that for now. Now in the 285 twin, when piston 1 is at top dead center and exerting an upward secondary force, piston 2 is at 75 degrees, so it's not exerting a maximum downward secondary force. In other words, the secondary force of piston 2 is not sufficient to fully cancel out the force of piston 1, and we have secondary vibrations. In other words, the 285 twin does not have better secondary balance than the 270 twin. It is in fact a bit worse. However, it is important to understand that primary and secondary forces occur simultaneously. So it's also a good idea to compare the total forces of the engines, or primary and secondary forces added up. So for the 270 engine, we have piston 1 at top dead center and piston 2 at 90 degrees. We have maximum upward force on piston 1 and a small downward force on piston 2 because piston 2 is past the point of peak velocity. The small downward force of piston 2 cancels out a part of the large upward force of piston 1. The result is that we have less overall force, but we do have forces on both sides of the engine. If we plot both pistons on the graph, they look like this. And if we add the total forces of both of the pistons, then we get the total force for the engine as a whole, and that looks like this. In the 285 engine, we have maximum upward force on piston 1 and zero force on piston 2 because it's at the point of peak velocity. The result is that we don't have forces on both sides of the engine, but we have a greater overall force because no part of the force of piston 1 is cancelled out. If we plot the total forces of both pistons on the same graph for the 285, that looks like this. And then if we add both of the pistons to get one graph for the engine as a whole, that looks like this. If we plot the total forces of both engines on the same graph, we can see that the 285 has a higher peak force, so it's worse in terms of balance. Well, yes, but also no, because the 270 has forces on both sides of the engine. We must not forget that, so it has a slight rocking, so that's worse. Not really. In terms of overall balance, neither is worse. They are just different. Each has its advantages and drawbacks in terms of balance. If we were pedantic, we could argue that the overall, in terms of balance, the 285 is worse because it has a secondary vibration, and to get rid of that secondary vibration completely, we would need two balance shafts moving at twice the speed of the crankshaft, but of course, because of space and weight constraints, such balance shafts are never employed in motorcycles, and also the secondary vibration in a 285 is so small that it's pretty much unnoticeable, so it's just left ignored. It must be also understood that the primary imbalances of both of these engines can be balanced out using balancing shafts that move at the speed of the crankshaft, so primary balancing shafts, if you will, and these primary imbalances, vibrations, can be balanced out to varying degrees using either one or two balancing shafts. Now on to issue number 2 from Fortnine's video. Phil Irving, the father of the Crossplane twin. Why did he suggest 285 over 270? Because 285 has a much better balance than a 360 twin, but also a much more regular firing interval than a 180-degree twin, and a slightly more regular firing interval than a 270 twin. A more regular firing interval makes the engine feel smoother in operation. Now, because the engine has a much better balance than a 360, it requires much less flywheel or counterweight mass to balance it out, and if we have less mass in the rotating assembly, then the engine revs up, it spins more freely, and that's always a good thing. But also because the engine has a more regular firing interval, it feels smoother than a 180 or even slightly more smoother than a 270, especially at low and mid RPM, where the gaps in the firing interval are more apparent. Now, I believe that the potential traction advantages of an irregular firing interval were not yet observed in the 60s, so that's something to keep in mind, that this was all happening, Phil Irving, in the 60s. Now, 30 years later, Dick Cookson, the man who put Phil Irving's idea into practice by modifying a Triumph 360 into a 76-degree Triumph, he himself, who analyzed Phil Irving's ideas to great detail, admits that the 270 actually has a better balance than the 285. The only advantage of the 285 is that it doesn't have this little rocking of the engine. Now, Dick Cookson was building his engine in a shed using basic rudimentary tools. Nowadays, with factories and very, very accurate production and engine clearances and whatever, we really do not have a problem with this rocking in the 270. This can easily be balanced out, and as we know, the 270 Yamaha CP Twin, which has a single balance shaft, is one of the most reliable engines, motorcycle engines in existence today, probably in most of motorcycling history, so that tells you something about how this rocking is not an issue. The other thing that Dick Cookson mentions is that the 285 Twin has an advantage in that it has a more continuous turning motion. What he's trying to say here is that when piston 1 is at top dead center and it is experiencing the inertia at top dead center or bottom dead center, the other piston counteracts this by being at peak velocity. So the result of this is that we do not have fluctuations in crankshaft rotation speed. The crankshaft rotation speed is very continuous, and this again also contributes to engine smoothness. However, the difference here between the 285 and the 270 is just 15 degrees. This is absolutely minimal, but it is quantifiable. And now issue number 3, cost. The 285 is apparently more expensive because
manufacturing an oblique offset requires a twisting stage after forging, and that machine is expensive.
Now, to me, this doesn't make sense. I may be wrong here. I do not have first-hand experience with how inline twin cranks, crossplane cranks are manufactured, but to me, intuitively and what I know about crank manufacturing, it doesn't make sense that 15 degrees of difference of offset requires a completely different manufacturing process. I think that either both cranks need to be twisted after they are die forged, or neither of the cranks need to be twisted after they are die forged, and not just one of them. The footage they're showing in the video, this is an inline 5 crankshaft, as we can see, 5 small, narrow journals, so 5 cylinders. It's an inline 5, and inline 3, inline 5, inline 6, all of these, as far as I know, require twisting after die forging because they have these offsets. But V8 crankshafts, they have 90-degree offsets, and they also require a twisting after the forging. So either both or neither of the Crossplane twin cranks requires forging and twisting, so I don't think there's a significant difference in their manufacturing cost. If somebody has first-hand experience with this, working actually with this, knows it for a fact, I would very much appreciate your words in the comments section. The final note adding on to this is that KTM manufacturers are the only company that manufactures 285 because they're not afraid to basically ask big money and because they spend big money making these cranks. I think that KTM manufactures 285 cranks because they charge a special price for their motorcycles, and when you pay special money, then you expect a slightly special feeling. Your KTM must somehow be different from your plebeian friend's Yamaha. And the slightly different firing interval and the slightly different balance leads to a slightly different sound and a slightly different feeling for the KTM engines. They are not superior in terms of balance, and they do not offer any significant performance advantages due to their crankshaft configuration. I also noticed that in the comment section of the Fortnine video, many people commented, "Oh, I finally know why my KTM is so smooth." No. It may be perceived as smoother than a Yamaha CP Twin, CP2, because the Yamaha CP2 has one balancing shaft. The KTM has two. That's really all there is to it, and it has a slightly less irregular firing interval, although I doubt you can feel that. So, one more thing. While I was scrolling through the comments in the Fortnite video, I was trying to find somebody in the comments pointing out the issues. I found no one, and I have to say that made me proud of the audience on this channel, because if I said some of those things, I know that about 50% of the comments would be, "You're wrong." So I have to say that made me proud of the audience. Before we end the video, I'd just like to say a very, 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 very big thank you to one of my subscribers who you can find on Twitter, that's X now, as Kwahu / do you call that? Kwahu, the thing down, archive. He sent me an email. I didn't initially watch this Fortnite video. He sent me an email. I was stupid enough to initially dismiss his claims, but after going back and forth through emails, I realized he was right, and there was definitely something that needed to be corrected here. So once again, a big thank you to Kwahu Archive. So to sum it up, the 285 is not in any inherent way better than a 270, not in terms of balance or anything else. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon with more fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel.